P.T. Logan's 5 Minutes of Terror. Twisted, troubling tales to send a chill up your spine.
Luggage. The woman grunted and clenched her teeth as she tried to lift Mrs. Houlihan's bag. In order to get it onto the weighing station, she had to lean all the way back to raise it high enough. Sweat dripped down her face as she breathed a sigh of relief. "What do you have in there?" the woman grumbled under her breath. "Just the essentials," Mrs. Houlihan replied. The woman slid behind the counter and raised an eyebrow, but she didn't say anything. All she did was cast a glance at the digital readout on the scale. "Too heavy?" Mrs. Houlihan asked. The woman nodded, and Mrs. Houlihan looked at the scale. There was no weight listed in red digital numbers, but a word. Error. "What are my options?" "Well, you can either remove some of the items or purchase another bag or two. As it stands, it's too heavy to load onto the plane." Mrs. Houlihan pushed her large round glasses up her nose and then scratched her gray perm. "Okay." With that, she unzipped the bag. She kept it partially closed so that the lady behind the counter couldn't see inside. Then Mrs. Houlihan reached in and with a grunt of her own yanked something out. It was an 8-year-old boy. "Come on, Clark." The boy looked tired, with puffy eyes, and his hair was a mess, but otherwise looked completely normal. "Is that okay?" Mrs. Houlihan asked. The lady behind the counter's mouth fell open. "Excuse me, is it light enough now?" The woman's eyes went wide and they both looked at the scale. It still read error. "Darn it," Mrs. Houlihan grumbled. Without a word from the woman, she reached into the bag and yanked hard. Another boy came leaping out. He was 9 or 10, with dark circles under his eyes. "Hi, Mom," the boy said sleepily. "Hi, Tony," Mrs. Houlihan replied, before turning her attention back to the attendant. "What about now?" The woman was flabbergasted and evidently couldn't speak. But the bag was still too heavy. It still read error. Mrs. Houlihan, feeling frustrated now, shook her head and shoved both of her hands into the bag this time. Then, leaning back like the woman behind the desk had done moments before, Mrs. Houlihan pulled with both arms. 2 more boys came out, one 9 and one 10 years old. "Dave and Matt, stand with your brothers," Mrs. Houlihan instructed. They listened, but then they started to argue with each other. "Now?" But the scale still read error. "Oh, give me a break, and boys, stop fighting." Mrs. Houlihan repeated the same process, removing 2 more boys from the oversized luggage. The bag was still too heavy. Mrs. Houlihan threw her arms up, looked skyward, and then turned her attention back to her bag. Instead of using both hands this time, she put her right hand in and pulled. A boy named Frank came out. Just as he cleared the zipper, Mrs. Houlihan reached in with her left hand and pulled out Timmy. She continued to alternate pulling her boys out of the bag for nearly a full minute. When she was soaked with sweat and exhausted, there were 17 boys, ranging from 7 to 13 years of age, standing around the ticket counter. And they were loud and boisterous. Finally, the scale had a reading, and it was well under the weight limit. Is that okay now?" she asked. But the woman behind the counter still didn't answer. She looked confused and slightly terrified. "Excuse me, is it?" But then one of her boys shoved another, and they started to argue. If the woman behind the counter had replied, Mrs. Houlihan couldn't hear her on account of her boys fighting. "Please, I'm so tired. And you would be too if you had 17 boys to look after. I was going to sleep on the entire flight." When the woman still said nothing, Mrs. Houlihan begged, "Please." When it was apparent that no answer was forthcoming, Mrs. Houlihan did the only thing she could think of in her tired state. She leaned forward and crawled into the luggage bag. Then, staring out at her boys, she slowly zipped it closed. It was dark and warm inside the bag, and as Mrs. Houlihan closed her eyes to finally get some rest, she heard a muffled voice say, "Yeah, this bag is under the limit. It's good to go."
P.T. Logan's 5 Minutes of Terror. Twisted, troubling tales to send a chill up your spine.